This is Chapter 26 of Sketches New and Old. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sketches New and Old by Mark Twain, Chapter 26, Riley, Newspaper Correspondent. One of the best men in Washington, or elsewhere, is Riley, correspondent of one of the great San Francisco dailies. Riley is full of humor, and has an unfailing vein of irony which makes his conversation to the last degree entertaining, as long as the remarks are about somebody else. But notwithstanding the possession of these qualities, which should enable a man to write a happy and an appetizing letter, Riley's newspaper letters often display a more than earthly solemnity, and likewise an unimaginative devotion to petrified facts, which surprise and distress all men who know him in his unofficial character. He explains this curious thing by saying that his employers sent him to Washington to write facts, not fancy, and that several times he has come near losing his situation by inserting humorous remarks which, not being looked for at headquarters, and consequently not understood, were thought to be dark and bloody speeches intended to convey signals and warnings to murderous secret societies, or something of that kind, and so were scratched out with a shiver and a prayer and cast into the stove. Riley says that sometimes he is so afflicted with a yearning to write a sparkling and absorbingly readable letter that he simply cannot resist it, and so he goes to his den and revels in the delight of untrammeled scribbling, and then, with suffering such as only a mother can know, he destroys the pretty children of his fancy and reduces his letter to the required dismal accuracy. Having seen Riley do this very thing more than once, I know whereof I speak. Often I have laughed with him over a happy passage, and grieved to see him plow his pen through it. He would say, "I had to write that or die, and I've got to scratch it out, or starve. They wouldn't stand it, you know." I think Riley is about the most entertaining company I ever saw. We lodged together in many places in Washington during the winter of '67–8, moving comfortably from place to place, and attracting attention by paying our board, a course which cannot fail to make a person conspicuous in Washington. Riley would tell all about his trip to California in the early days by way of the Isthmus and the San Juan River, and about his baking bread in San Francisco to gain a living, and setting up ten-pins, and practicing law, and opening oysters, and delivering lectures, and teaching French, and tending bar, and reporting for the newspapers, and keeping dancing schools, and interpreting Chinese in the courts, which latter was lucrative, and Riley was doing handsomely and laying up a little money when people began to find fault because his translations were too free, a thing for which Riley considered he ought not to be held responsible, since he did not know a word of the Chinese tongue, and only adopted interpreting as a means of gaining an honest livelihood. Through the machinations of enemies he was removed from the position of official interpreter, and a man put in his place who was familiar with the Chinese language, but did not know any English. And Riley used to tell about publishing a newspaper up in what is Alaska now, but was only an iceberg then, with a population composed of bears, walruses, Indians, and other animals, and how the iceberg got adrift at last and left all his paying subscribers behind, and as soon as the Commonwealth floated out of the jurisdiction of Russia, the people rose and threw off their allegiance and ran up the English flag, calculating to hook on and become an English colony as they drifted along down the British possessions. But a land breeze and a crooked current carried them by, and they ran up the Stars and Stripes and steered for California, missed the connection again, and swore allegiance to Mexico. But it wasn't any use. The anchors came home every time, and away they went with the northeast trades drifting off sideways towards the Sandwich Islands, whereupon they ran up the cannibal flag and had a grand human barbecue in honor of it, in which it was noticed that the better a man liked a friend, the better he enjoyed him. And as soon as they got fairly within the tropics the weather got so fearfully hot that the iceberg began to melt, and it got so sloppy underfoot that it was almost impossible for ladies to get about at all. And at last, just as they came in sight of the islands, the melancholy remnant of the once majestic iceberg canted first to one side and then to the other, and then plunged under forever, carrying the national archives along with it, and not only the archives and the populace, but some eligible town lots which had increased in value as fast as they diminished in size in the tropics, and which Riley could have sold at 30 cents a pound and made himself rich if he could have kept the province afloat 10 hours longer and got her into port. Riley is very methodical, untiringly accommodating, never forgets anything that is to be attended to, is a good son, a staunch friend, and a permanent reliable enemy. He will put himself to any amount of trouble to oblige a body, and therefore always has his hands full of things to be done for the helpless and the shiftless. And he knows how to do nearly everything, too. He is a man whose native benevolence is a well-spring that never goes dry. He stands always ready to help whoever needs help, as far as he is able, and not simply with his money, for that is a cheap and common charity, but with hand and brain, and fatigue of limb, and sacrifice of time. This sort of men is rare. Riley has a ready wit, a quickness and aptness at selecting and applying quotations, and a countenance that is as solemn and as blank as the back-side of a tombstone when he is delivering a particularly exasperating joke. One night a negro woman was burned to death in a house next door to us, and Riley said that our landlady would be oppressively emotional at breakfast, because she generally made use of such opportunities as offered, being of a morbidly sentimental turn, and so we should find it best to let her talk along and say nothing back. It was the only way to keep her tears out of the gravy. Riley said there never was a funeral in the neighborhood but that the gravy was watery for a week. And sure enough, at breakfast the landlady was down in the very sloughs of woe, entirely broken-hearted. Everything she looked at reminded her of that poor old negro woman, and so the buckwheat cakes made her sob, the coffee forced a groan, and when the beefsteak came on she fetched a wail that made our hair rise. Then she got to talking about deceased, and kept up a steady drizzle till both of us were soaked through and through. Presently she took a fresh breath and said, with a world of sobs, "Ah, to think of it! Only to think of it! The poor old faithful creature! For she was so faithful. Would you believe it? She had been a servant in that self-same house and that self-same family for 27 years come Christmas, and never a cross word and never a lick. And oh, to think she should meet such a death at last, a-sitting over the red-hot stove at 3 o'clock in the morning, and went to sleep, and fell on it, and was actually roasted, not just frizzled up a bit, but literally roasted to a crisp. Poor faithful creature, how she was cooked! I am but a poor woman, but even if I have to scrimp to do it, I will put up a tombstone over that lone sufferer's grave. And, Mr. Riley, if you would have the goodness to think up a little epitaph to put on it, which would sort of describe the awful way in which she met her—" "Put it, 'Well done, good and faithful servant,'" said Riley, and never smiled. Chapter 27.